From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NOCO, a daily slice of Northern Colorado news and happenings. It's Friday, February 16th. I'm Erin O'Toole. As a teen, author Oscar Hokeah was an avid reader. He devoured dark fantasy novels and envisioned writing Native American versions of those stories. His studies drew him on a more literary path, but it took a long time to get there.
So the last grade I completed was the sixth grade. And then I got a GED when I was 17. And so I didn't even think of myself as being, even though I read all the time and I would write all the time, I just never thought of myself as being someone who would go to college.
At the age of 29, Hokeah returned to school and began studying literary fiction. He was determined to bring his perspective as an Indigenous person to a field that has only a small percentage of novelists from tribal communities. Now Hokeah is headlining the Fort Collins Book Fes with his debut novel, Calling for a Blanket Dance. I sat down with Hokeah, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, to talk about the book and the powerful cultural elements he brings to the page. So the theme of this year's Fort Collins Book Fest is One Community, Many Stories. And it seems like your novel and the way it's written just fits perfectly within that theme. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so my debut novel, Calling for a Blanket Dance, is what I describe as polyvocal, where we have every chapter is narrated by a different family member of the main character. So the main character's name is Saddle. And so like first chapter is grandma, and then we got grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings, all the way until the last chapter where the main character speaks for himself. And I thought it was a good way of, trying to capture what it's like to live inside of this kind of really tightly knit family group, this kind of collective way of looking at the world. And so having each of these family members tell something significant that they had encountered with their relative was just a really great way of capturing the kind of tribal communal aspect of living and growing up in a Native community.
Well, family is an important cultural element within tribal communities. And we really get to experience that as we read this story and as we follow your main character, Ever, through his life. Could you talk about the importance of family and maybe who is a family?
Yeah, so I think that, whenever we think of family, oftentimes, like there's certain distinctions in the Native community. We have aunts and uncles, but oftentimes they're more like mothers and fathers, and our cousins are more like our siblings. So a lot of our terminology might mean specifically those things. It might be more like brother instead of cousin, or sister instead of cousin. And we're so tightly knit that even within the language itself, it speaks to this kind of bonding aspect, and trying to hold each other close so that we can depend on each other and lean on each other, especially during hard times, like we see throughout the novel itself, as we see Ever go through his obstacles and how his family steps in. And then later in the novel, how he shows up for his family. Family is super important, and we see those distinctions as they play out in our language and how we interact and how involved we are. And so whenever you see a character in the novel who is like, would be considered a great aunt, but she's still heavily involved in the main character's life. So it's not just like a nuclear family type of situation, but it extends out further into the family structure, so relatives that might be second cousins, third cousins are still a significant part of our lives.
The notion of intergenerational trauma and how deeply it affects Indigenous people is central to Calling for a Blanket Dance. What do you want readers to take away about this kind of trauma and what it means for the lives of Native people?
I definitely would like for readers to get a sense of how we are working diligently to correct that historical trauma. So we not only within our family groups, but within the community, and the service work that we do in our communities, to help the next generation, help youth. And so like the main character, Ever Saddle, adopts a young Comanche kid. And so, in his working life as well as his personal life, I mean, he's taking steps to try to heal that historical trauma or that intergenerational trauma that keeps kind of showing back up. And so, like I work in Indian child welfare. I think that in just our department alone, there's well over 100 employees, and we're all working toward helping with this intergenerational trauma. And so I'd like for readers just to walk away with the sense of that we are, working toward healing that, and we lean on each other for strength.
One of my favorite parts of the book is when Ever's grandfather, Vincent, picks him up along with his cousin Quentin from school, and they're in the truck, and he's trying to share with them some knowledge about tribal customs and colors and symbols, and they are just not picking up on it. They keep saying, "But my favorite color is blue."
Oh yeah.
It's treated with humor and love, and I love that part. How important is it for this wisdom to be passed along to the younger generations?
Yeah, no, that is super important. And as you grow up, I mean, in that particular chapter, the main character is 5 years old with his cousin, who's also five, and their grandfather, Vincent Gimusel, is trying to teach them about Gort dance cultures and certain patterns that are distinctive to the Kiowa tribe and certain color schemes that are distinctive to Kiowas in order to try to read the regalia. So whenever I go into what I would call, a traditional Gort dance, I can look at an individual and based on what they're wearing, I can tell like what families they're from and what just different society works that they're part of, just different aspects of who they are, just by what they're wearing. And so that's what he's trying to teach his grandsons. But they're young, they're 5 years old, and they're like they're kind of misfiring, like they're kind of talking over each other in that particular scene.
Right.
And so it's kind of funny, but very true to how it is. Because I've had, I have six kids myself, and I remember with every kid having those moments of trying to explain to them, you're Indian, and you're Kiowa and you're Cherokee, and just trying to get them to understand how that intertwines.
Mm. I realize advocacy and community outreach are a big part of your life. You mentioned working with Indian child welfare. Could you talk about that and how it's informed your writing and some of the characters in Calling for a Blanket Dance?
Yes, yeah. So I've worked with at-risk Native youth for 20 years. This year would be 20 years exactly. So I started in 2004 in an all-Native group home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Right now, I work at Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and I work in the Indian Child Welfare Department. So it's like a social worker, social services type of an environment. And so in my novel and my writing in general, I tend to write about characters who are working with youth and trying to correct some of that intergenerational trauma that we had mentioned. And so the main character, as we see, whenever he becomes an adult and he's trying to do his part for the community, we see where I mentioned where he adopts Leander Chestnut and he's working in the group home and he's doing very similar things that I drew directly from my personal life. But I tend to like to write about adults who work with youth. And so that's showing up again in my second book that I'm working on now. I've already written the first draft to a third book, and that's definitely the main aspect of that book as well. So I think that as far as I can see anyway, that theme is going to continue as I continue to write.
Oscar Hokeah's debut novel is Calling for a Blanket Dance. He'll be in Fort Collins Saturday as part of this year's Fort Collins Book Fest. Oscar, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
You'll find a schedule of events for the Fort Collins Book Fest in our show notes and at kunc.org. That's it for us today here on In the NOCO. We'll be back with you next week with more of what's happening in Northern Colorado. Robin Vincent is our executive producer. I'm your host, Erin O'Toole. Have a great weekend.